Back to your daily dose of dopamine. My name is Robert. I'm here with Jan, visiting professor from the University of Oslo. Once again, the article that we're discussing is Able Nationalists Assemble on Disability in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I highlight a couple things. I'm just going to read back to you, and I would love this idea for you to just expound on a few things that I pulled. One was that superheroes are, by definition, more powerful than ordinary humans, but they must also, as a rule, have a significant weakness. Why do you think that's a rule?
Well, I think it's in order to make them narratively interesting. I mean, the most boring superhero has always been Superman because he's too powerful. He's basically a god. Most interesting heroes have some sort of, well, weakness, yes, or vulnerability, which allows for identification, which allows for narrative tension, and so on. So it's interesting how that vulnerability is often embodied in the form of an impairment, in the form of a disability, because that brings with it other forms of ideological baggage that isn't always well processed or well handled by those stories. So disability becomes a trope, becomes a stereotype, and functions in interesting and unpredictable ways in those fictional universes.
Well, and you mentioned being inviting in the audience, right? That the most boring person, like you said, Superman, or say Neo in the Matrix, when he becomes a god, it's like there's no more dramatic tension. I argue that all the time. This line you write, a disabled protagonist, like most superheroes, is a natural outsider. That is a relatable trope, the fish out of water, the not being stigmatized or somehow removed. Why is that important, you think, to identify as somehow either being removed from, kicked out of, or not included in a society?
Well, I mean, th this is probably a variant of the oldest narrative strategy for building identification that there is. I mean, um, you have stories about children, whether children are orphans. You have Harry Potter would be a contemporary example. Of course, he also has the scar, the embodied mark. But I think the main thing is that it's a very common strategy to make the protagonist unusual and vulnerable in some way. Now, with that strategy comes a way of relating to the world. You're bringing the world with you. And for many authors, and I include the authors of many superhero stories in this, that doesn't entail the level of commitment to the thing that you use to build identification. So there's a lower degree of realism. Disability is portrayed in very strange ways. Of course, the superhero universes are not meant to be realistic, but there is this sense of disability becoming a magical, extremely flexible tool for characterization, which then reflects back upon our world in problematic ways.
Well, and I love that you bring that up, and it comes up in your article, that the power of metaphor, right? That the point is, because some people argue, oh, well, that could never be. It's like, well, the point isn't to see it literally. In fact, it is to see things expansively and to garner the reflection in a way that maybe makes us reconsider our literal view of the world. I often say to my students, there's more truth in fiction than in perspective fact. Um,
Mhm.
that takes them a little time. You have a good dive into one of my favorite characters in the MCU, which is Tony Stark, aka Iron Man. Talk to me about his path to redemption from who he was to how he survived and became Iron Man.
Yeah, I mean I think it's been talked about a lot by now, but it was a really interesting choice to kickstart the Marvel Cinematic Universe to pick a third tier character, although having him played by Robert Downey Jr. was obviously part of it. But to choose a character who was human, who was not a superhuman, but who is injured out in the desert in the middle of nowhere and has to literally build the machine that will save his life. So there's, of course, ingenuity, there's narrative propulsion in that. Redemption, yeah, I guess that has more to do with American guilt over the never-ending wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I'm not sure how that actually works out in those films. But he does make for an interesting superhero just by virtue of being more vulnerable than most of them. So he's in his invincible suit, but he still has a very vulnerable, very human heart, literally so. They make a point about this in the movie, and it makes for a much more engaging narrative than, say, the Superman films that came out around that time.
Right. Well, what Superman and Iron Man both try to do, and ultimately is one of the oldest tropes there is settle and couch this in love, right? The human, the ultimate human emotion. And that would be the superhero emotion, as it were. And actually, that'll lead us into what I think will be our final segment, which I look forward to. I want to talk about Deadpool.
Yeah.
And one of the funny lines from there is how he frames right in the beginning of the film, this is a love story. And, with everything that happens, that can make people go, what? We'll talk about that in the next episode. Okay.